I missed my stepson's call on purpose. It was Tuesday, 9:12 a.m., and the kettle was already screaming on my stove. He called again before the water boiled, then again while I was pouring it into my mug. I stood there watching the steam fog the window, noticing a manila folder on my counter that hadn't been there the night before. I used to believe ignoring family was the worst thing a person could do. I was about to learn how expensive that belief really was. I missed my stepson's call on purpose. It was Tuesday morning, 9:12 a.m. Mine of time where nothing important is supposed to happen. The kettle was already screaming on the stove, sharp and impatient, the way it always did when I forgot to turn it down. I didn't rush. I reached for the mug I'd been using every morning since my husband died, the white one with the chipped handle, and poured the water slowly, watching steam curl up and blur the window above the sink. The phone buzzed again on the counter. Same name, same ringtone. I let it vibrate until it stopped. 3 weeks ago, I would have picked up before the second ring. 3 weeks ago, I still believed that when family called, you answered, even if you were tired, even if you didn't feel like talking, even if the conversation always left you feeling smaller than when it started. I stood there in my kitchen, barefoot on cold tile, and noticed something that hadn't been there the night before. A manila folder sat near the edge of the counter, half tucked under yesterday's mail. Plain, no label, no handwriting, just thick, stiff paper, the kind offices use when they want documents to feel official. I stared at it longer than I should have. The phone rang again. I turned the kettle off, wrapped both hands around my mug, and waited for the sound to stop. My name is Linda Harris. I'm 68 years old, and for most of my life, I was a librarian in a public middle school outside Dayton, Ohio. Not the kind of librarian who shushed kids and guarded dusty shelves, but the kind who helped 12-year-olds find books about astronauts and volcanoes and whatever they were obsessing over that week. I spent 34 years explaining how to look things up, how to check sources, how to read what was actually written instead of what you wanted to see. I retired 5 years ago, the same year my husband, Mark, had his first heart attack. He survived that one. The second one, 2 years later, he didn't. Mark had been widowed when I met him. His son, Andrew, was already grown, already living his own life in Columbus, already polite and distant in the way adult children sometimes are, with a new stepmother. We never fought. We never bonded, either. We existed in the same family the way people exist in the same waiting room, nodding, making small talk, never quite sure what we owed each other. After Mark died, Andrew became more present. Not physically, he still lived 2 hours away, but in my phone, in my inbox, in my mailbox. He checked in, asked if I was managing the house okay, asked if I'd looked into downsizing, asked if I had help with all the paperwork. At first, I was grateful. Grief has a way of making even simple decisions feel heavy. What to do with a closet full of someone else's clothes? What to do with a garage that hadn't been cleaned out since 1998? What to do with a future you hadn't planned to navigate alone? Andrew framed every conversation the same way: concern, efficiency, responsibility. He never raised his voice, never demanded anything. He spoke like a man who had read articles about aging parents and wanted to do things the right way. Just planning ahead, he'd say. Just making sure everything's in order, before it becomes stressful. I told myself I was lucky. Other women my age talked about children who never called, never visited, never cared. Andrew called. Andrew cared. Andrew had spreadsheets. The phone rang again. I took a sip of my tea. It was too hot, and it burned my tongue, sharp enough to make my eyes water. I welcomed the distraction. 3 weeks earlier, Andrew had driven down unexpectedly. No holiday, no birthday, just a Tuesday afternoon visit. He brought bagels from a place he said was supposed to be good, though they tasted like any grocery store bagel to me. He sat at my kitchen table, the same one where Mark and I used to drink coffee every morning, and asked me how I was sleeping. I remember thinking it was an odd question. "Fine," I said. "Why?" He shrugged. "Just checking." That was the day he suggested we loop in a professional. Someone neutral. Someone who could help us look at the big picture. He said it casually, like he was suggesting a new mechanic or a dentist. I told him I'd think about it. 2 days later, he emailed me 3 names. The folder on my counter was thick enough to hold more than one set of papers. The phone buzzed again, then stopped. Silence settled back into the kitchen, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the faint tick of the clock above the door. I hadn't realized how tense my shoulders were until they dropped. I carried my mug to the table and sat down, facing the window that looked out onto my backyard. Mark had planted that maple tree the summer we got married. It was taller now, its leaves starting to turn, just a hint of red creeping in at the edges. Change you could see coming from miles away, if you paid attention. I reached for the folder. It was heavier than I expected. Inside were neatly stacked papers, clipped together, all printed in the same clean font. The top page had my name on it, spelled correctly, followed by words I recognized and others I didn't. Assessment. Recommendations. Next steps. I flipped through slowly. There were notes about my house, its square footage, its maintenance costs, notes about my support system, about my decision-making capacity, about how often I should be consulted versus how often decisions could be streamlined. Nothing in the folder said I was incapable. Nothing said I was confused or unsafe. Everything was polite, reasonable, helpful. It just wasn't written by me. The phone rang again. This time, I didn't even look at it. I thought about the last conversation I'd had with Andrew, the way he'd nodded while I spoke, the way his eyes had drifted to his watch when I took too long to explain something. I thought about how often he'd said "we" lately, what we thought was best, what we should probably consider. I thought about how easy it had been to let someone else take the lead when you were tired. The call went to voicemail. I closed the folder and slid it back across the table, aligning it carefully with the edge, the way I used to straighten stacks of returned books at the end of the day. Habit, order, control, where you could find it. I wasn't angry. Not yet. What I felt was something quieter, colder, a sense that a line had been crossed without anyone asking whether it was there in the first place. I stood up, carried my mug to the sink, and rinsed it out. The water ran a little too hard, splashing against the sides. I adjusted the handle, watching my hands move, steady and familiar. Hands that had shelved thousands of books. Hands that had signed report cards and permission slips and, once, a marriage license I'd thought would last the rest of my life. My phone lit up again, face down on the counter. I let it ring. I didn't know it yet. But this was the last quiet morning I would have in that kitchen. The last day I could pretend that being agreeable was the same thing as being safe. The last moment before everything I believed about good intentions, family loyalty, and doing the right thing began to unravel, piece by careful piece. By the time I left the house that morning, the folder was still sitting on the kitchen table, exactly where I'd placed it. I didn't take it with me. I didn't throw it away. I wanted to see if it would still feel heavy when I came back, or if it would shrink into something harmless once I put a few hours between us. It didn't. I drove to the grocery store on Main Street, the one I'd been going to for years. Same parking lot, same automatic doors that opened a second too slowly, same smell of rotisserie chicken and floor cleaner. I grabbed a cart, even though I only needed a few things, and followed my usual route without thinking. Produce first, then dairy, then the back aisle, where they keep the tea Mark liked. I still bought it out of habit, even though I hadn't opened a box in months. As I reached for the shelf, my phone buzzed again. A text this time. Andrew, just checking in. Call me when you get a minute. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, then slid the phone back into my purse. Around me, people moved with the casual urgency of a weekday morning retirees debating apples, a young mother negotiating cereal with her toddler, a man in a suit checking his watch near the express lane. No one looked worried. No one looked like their sense of self was quietly being reorganized without their consent. I paid for my groceries and drove home. The house felt different when I walked in, though nothing had changed. Same furniture, same pictures on the wall. Mark's jacket still hung on the hook by the door because I hadn't yet decided what to do with it. The folder waited on the table, patient. I made lunch. I didn't really want half a sandwich, too much mustard, and sat down across from it. I opened it again, this time slower, more deliberate. I wasn't reading for reassurance anymore. I was reading for ownership. There were phrases that stuck out now, ones I'd skimmed past earlier. In collaboration with family, best interest, future-oriented planning. None of it was wrong. Exactly. That was the unsettling part. It was all written in a language that assumed agreement before it ever asked for it. I thought back to my first year at the school library, decades ago. A new principal had come in, full of ideas, eager to modernize. He'd talked about streamlining access and optimizing resources. It took a semester before anyone realized that meant cutting library hours and replacing them with tablets that no one knew how to use. Good intentions, confidently applied, could do a lot of damage. That afternoon, I finally listened to Andrew's voicemail. His voice was calm, friendly, slightly rushed. "Hey, Linda, just wanted to make sure you saw the materials. No pressure, just thought it would be helpful to get everything in one place. Call me when you're ready." Materials. As if they were brochures for a vacation I might enjoy, not a plan for my life. I didn't call him back. Instead, I pulled out the small filing cabinet in the hallway, the one Mark and I had shared. Taxes, insurance, deeds, warranties for appliances we no longer owned. I wasn't looking for anything specific at first. I just wanted to remind myself what my own handwriting looked like on official paper. There were years of it, notes in the margins, sticky tabs, dates circled, uncircled, then circled again. I had never been careless with details. I had simply trusted that no one would take them out of my hands without asking. I found the house deed near the bottom, exactly where it should be. My name, Mark's name. Nothing unusual. That should have reassured me. It didn't. What unsettled me was how easy it would be for someone else to tell a convincing story about why I shouldn't have to deal with any of this anymore. That evening, Andrew called again. This time, I answered. "Hey," he said, like we'd spoken earlier that day. I was starting to worry. "I've been busy," I said. It wasn't a lie. "Did you look at the folder?" "Yes. And," I paused, "it's very thorough." He laughed softly, relieved. "Right? I thought you'd appreciate that. It's just about making things easier down the road." "For whom?" I asked. There was a beat of silence. Not long, just long enough to register. "For you," he said. "Obviously." We talked for another 10 minutes. About nothing, really. The weather, a leak in his basement, a neighbor dispute that bored me halfway through the story. He didn't push. He didn't need to. The plan was already moving, whether I stepped into it willingly or not. After we hung up, I sat alone in the living room, the lights off, the glow from the street lamp outside stretching across the floor. I thought about the way Andrew spoke, always slightly ahead of me, as if he were narrating my future in real time. I remembered something Mark used to say when his son was younger. Andrew likes to solve problems before anyone knows they exist. He'd said it with pride then. I wasn't sure what it meant now. Over the next few days, small things began to shift. Emails I didn't recall agreeing to arrived with my name on them. Appointments labeled tentative showed up on my calendar. A woman from an office downtown left a message introducing herself as someone who would be working closely with me going forward. Each thing, on its own, was minor, easy to overlook. Together, they formed a shape I didn't like. I told myself I was overreacting, that this was what aging looked like. Other people stepping in, smoothing edges, handling logistics, that resisting it would make me look stubborn, paranoid, ungrateful. That night, I dreamed I was back in the school library, shelves half empty, students wandering around with no idea where anything belonged. Someone had rearranged everything while I was gone and left no map. I woke up before dawn, heart racing, and lay there listening to the house settle. Pipes clicked. The refrigerator hummed. The clock in the kitchen marked time without asking permission. When the sun finally rose, I got out of bed and made coffee. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't check my phone. I sat at the table with the folder open in front of me and read it again. This time, not as a participant, but as an observer. And that's when I noticed what wasn't there. My voice. There were references to conversations we'd never had. Assumptions presented as conclusions. Decisions framed as inevitabilities. It wasn't malicious. It was efficient. And it left no room for someone like me, someone who took time to consider, to hesitate, to decide in her own quiet way. I closed the folder and pushed it aside. For the first time since Mark died, I felt something close to anger. Not explosive, not loud, focused. I didn't know yet what I was going to do. I only knew that whatever came next would have to start with me stepping back into a role I'd been slowly vacating without noticing. I picked up my phone and opened my contacts. Not Andrew's name. Someone else. Someone who didn't already think they knew what was best for me. The name I tapped belonged to a woman I hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade. Her name was Karen Bloom, and she used to sit 3 desks away from me in the library office, back when the school district still believed librarians needed offices. Karen had been a guidance counselor, practical, unflappable, the kind of person who listened without interrupting and never rushed you toward a conclusion. When budget cuts came, she took an early retirement package and disappeared into what she called a quieter life. We exchanged Christmas cards for a few years. Then we didn't. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Linda Harris," she said, her voice warming immediately. "Well, that's a surprise." "I hope it's a good one," I said. "It depends," she replied. "Are you calling to invite me to lunch or to confess a crime?" I smiled despite myself. Lunch would be nice, but I might also need to talk. Askly, there was no hesitation. When? We met that afternoon at a diner just off Route 48, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and laminated menus that hadn't changed since the 90s. Karen was already there when I arrived, stirring her coffee, glasses perched on top of her head. "You look the same," she said as I slid into the booth. "You don't," I said honestly. "You look calmer," she laughed. "That's what happens when no one schedules your day for you." I told her everything, not dramatically, not in order, just facts, loosely connected. The folder, the calls, the way Andrew talked about my life as if it were a project already underway. Karen listened, nodding occasionally, her eyes sharp but kind. When I finished, she took a sip of coffee and said, "Has anyone actually asked you what you want?" The question landed harder than I expected. "I suppose they assume." "That's not what I asked," she said gently. I stared at the table, at the faint scratches left by decades of plates and forks. "No," I said. "No one has." Karen nodded once, as if confirming something she already suspected. "That's what I thought." She didn't tell me what to do. She didn't suggest lawyers or confrontation or ultimatums. She simply said, "Before you agree to anything, you should understand what's already been decided without you." "How?" She slid her phone across the table. "By asking questions, not the kind that sound defensive, the kind that make people explain their assumptions." That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The next morning, Andrew emailed again. This time, the subject line read, "Next steps." I didn't open it right away. Instead, I made a list on a yellow legal pad. Not of fears, not of grievances, just questions. Who initiated the assessment? Who provided the information? What decisions had already been discussed? What authority did anyone have, formally or informally? It felt strange, approaching my own life the way I used to approach a research assignment for a student. Identify the source, check for bias, follow the trail. I opened the email. It was polite, efficient. There was a proposed meeting date, a list of attendees, and a brief agenda. My name was listed second, right after Andrew's. The meeting was scheduled for a Friday morning, downtown, in an office I'd never visited. I replied with a single sentence. "Before confirming, I'd like to understand a few things. Can we talk?" He called within minutes. "I'm glad you're engaging with this. he said. "I was worried you might feel overwhelmed." "I'm not overwhelmed," I said. "I'm curious." There was a pause. About? About how this started. Another pause. Longer this time. "Well," he said carefully, "after Dad passed, I thought it would be responsible to make sure everything was set up properly. I talked to a colleague." "What? Colleague?" "A friend from work. His wife works in elder planning, and you gave her information about me." He hesitated. "General information. Did you ask me first?" "I didn't think it was necessary. It was just to explore options." Options. Again. By the time we hung up, my hands were shaking. Not from fear, from clarity. That afternoon, a woman named Denise left a voicemail. She introduced herself as a care coordinator and said she was excited to work together. She spoke as if we were already in motion, already aligned. I didn't call her back. Instead, I drove downtown to the county records office. I hadn't planned to. I just found myself there, sitting in the parking lot, engine idling, hands on the wheel. It felt ridiculous, like I was playing detective in a situation that didn't warrant it. But I went in anyway. The clerk at the desk was young, bored, and efficient. I asked for public records related to my property. Nothing unusual came up. No liens, no changes, no red flags. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. Because what unsettled me wasn't that something had already been taken. It was how easily it could be framed as being taken for my own good. On the way home, I stopped at the post office. There was a large envelope in my box, addressed to me in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside were copies of documents I'd already seen, along with a cover letter thanking me for my participation and outlining a timeline. Participation. As if silence counted as consent. That evening, Andrew showed up unannounced. I heard his car before I saw him, the crunch of tires on gravel. He knocked, then knocked again, harder. "Linda," he called. "I know you're home." I opened the door. He looked relieved, then concerned, then mildly irritated, all in the space of a second. He stepped inside without waiting to be invited. "I was starting to worry," he said. "You haven't been returning calls." "I've been thinking," I said. He glanced around the living room, as if checking for signs of decline. Everything was in its place. The room gave him nothing. "We're just trying to help," he said, softer now. "You don't have to do this alone." "I'm not," I replied. He frowned. "Who else have you talked to?" "A friend." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Friends mean well, but they don't always understand the bigger picture. I gestured toward the chair across from me. He sat. "Andrew," I said, "did you ever consider that the bigger picture includes me?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked unsure. "That's not fair," he said finally. "Everything we've done has been in your best interest." "In it signed. Defined by whom?" He exhaled slowly. "You're reading too much into this." "No," I said. "I'm reading exactly what's there." We sat in silence. The clock ticked, the house held. When he left, he hugged me awkwardly, as if unsure whether I might pull away. I didn't. That night, I updated my list of questions. I added answers where I had them, and next to several items, I wrote a single word: assumed. I wasn't being harmed. Not yet. But I was being positioned, labeled, prepared. And I was beginning to understand that the real danger wasn't losing control all at once. It was losing it so slowly that no one noticed when it was gone. The next few days passed without anything dramatic happening, which somehow made them worse. Nothing was taken. No papers were shoved in front of me. No one raised their voice or accused me of being incapable. Life continued at its usual pace. And yet it felt as if someone had adjusted the furniture in my mind just enough that I kept bumping into things. On Monday morning, I received a calendar invite I hadn't agreed to. Friday, 10 a.m., downtown. Same meeting Andrew had mentioned. My name was still listed second. I stared at the screen, then declined it without adding a note. 10 minutes later, Andrew texted. "Andrew, I saw you declined. Everything okay? I didn't answer. Instead, I went about my day. I watered the plants on the back porch, careful not to overdo it. I folded laundry that didn't need folding yet. I cleaned out a kitchen drawer that had been cluttered since Mark was alive, sorting rubber bands, old coupons, a key I no longer recognized. Every small task felt like proof. I could still decide things. I could still finish them. Around noon, the phone rang. This time it wasn't Andrew. "Hi, Linda," a woman said brightly. "This is Denise. We were scheduled to meet later this week, but I just wanted to touch base and see how you're feeling about everything." I closed my eyes. "I'm feeling fine," I said, "but I don't recall scheduling a meeting with you." There was a polite laugh on the other end. "Oh, of course. Andrew mentioned you might need a little time to warm up." Totally understandable. These transitions can feel overwhelming. Overwhelming. Again. "I haven't agreed to any transitions," I said. A pause. Not long. Just long enough to adjust. "Of course," Denise replied. "We're just here as a resource." After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall. Nothing Denise had said was offensive. If I repeated the conversation to anyone else, it would sound like care, support, initiative. And yet, I felt as if a version of me was being discussed in rooms I hadn't entered. That afternoon, I drove to the public library. Not the one where I'd worked, but the larger one downtown. The kind with glass walls and quiet study rooms. I hadn't been there since retiring. I walked the aisles slowly, running my fingers along the spines of books, grounding myself in something familiar. I picked a seat near the window and opened my notebook. Instead of questions, I started writing down statements I'd heard over the past few weeks. "You don't need to handle this alone. We're just planning ahead. This will make things easier. You'll thank us later." They all sounded reasonable. That was the problem. Reasonable statements were harder to argue with than cruel ones. I thought about something Karen had said at the diner. Ask questions that make people explain their assumptions. So I started doing that. That evening, I replied to Andrew's text. "Linda, I'm okay. I'd like to understand what decisions have already been discussed without me." His response came quickly. "Andrew, nothing has been decided. We're just exploring options." "Linda, who is we?" There was a longer delay this time. "Andrew, me, you, the professionals." "Linda, I haven't spoken to the professionals." "Andrew, not directly. No." I set the phone down. The next morning, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a packet labeled Preliminary Summary. It included notes from conversations I hadn't been part of, along with bullet points outlining agreed-upon concerns. Concerns about my home being too much. Concerns about future cognitive load. Concerns about long-term sustainability. I read the list twice, then a third time. Some of it was true. The house was big. Maintenance was tiring. I didn't enjoy paperwork any more than the next person. But the conclusions didn't belong to me. What struck me most was a small section near the end. Client demonstrates openness to guided decision-making. Client. I closed the packet and felt something tighten in my chest. Not panic. Recognition. This was how it happened. Not with a signature or a confrontation, but with language, with notes and summaries and reasonable-sounding phrases that slowly shifted ownership from the person living the life to the people managing it. That afternoon, I called Karen again. "They're writing about me," I said without preamble, as if I'm not there. "Are they wrong?" she asked gently. I thought about it. "They're not wrong about the facts," I said. "They're wrong about who gets to interpret them." Karen exhaled. "Then you need to interrupt the narrative." "How?" "By refusing to play the role they've assigned you," she said. "Stop reacting. Start defining." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the house settle, the familiar creaks and pops that used to comfort me. Instead, they felt like reminders of time passing, of people making plans on my behalf because they assumed time was working against me. At 3 a.m., I got up and went to the kitchen. I spread the documents across the table, the folder, the packet, printed emails. I didn't read them this time. I looked at them as objects: paper, ink, authority, borrowed and reinforced through repetition. There was one thing none of them contained: my signature. That realization steadied me. The next day, Andrew called again. His tone was different now, tighter. "Linda, we need to get on the same page," he said. "The longer this drags out, the more complicated it becomes." "For whom?" I asked. "For everyone," he said, impatience slipping through. "These people have schedules. They're professionals. And I'm a problem if I don't cooperate," I said. "That's not what I said." It lowed. "But it's what you mean." Silence stretched between us. "I just don't want you to make this harder than it needs to be," he said finally. I looked around my kitchen. At the table Mark and I had eaten at for years. At the calendar still hanging on the wall, untouched by anyone else's pen. "I'm not making it harder," I said. "I'm making it mine." After we hung up, I felt shaken. My hands trembled as I poured myself a glass of water. This was the first time Andrew had sounded frustrated, the first crack in his calm certainty. That crack told me something important. If I were truly incapable, they wouldn't be negotiating with me. They wouldn't need my cooperation. That realization didn't make me feel safe. It made me alert. By the end of the week, the pattern was clear. Every time I hesitated, someone reframed it as confusion. Every time I asked a question, it was labeled resistance. Every time I asserted myself, it was met with reassurance, as if I were a child who didn't understand her own needs. I wasn't being attacked. I was being managed. And the most unsettling part was how easy it would have been to let it happen, to sink into the soft chair they were pulling up for me and let someone else decide when I should stand again. Instead, I gathered the papers into a neat stack and slid them into the folder. I wasn't ready to confront anyone yet. I wasn't ready to expose the plan or tear it apart, but I was ready to stop being quiet. And for the first time, I understood that staying silent wasn't neutral. It was permission. The decision to stop being quiet didn't arrive with confidence. It came with a tightness in my chest and a low, steady hum of fear that followed me through the day. I didn't wake up that morning feeling brave. I woke up tired of translating other people's language, tired of reading emails twice to make sure I hadn't missed something that might later be used to explain why I hadn't responded appropriately, tired of the careful tone everyone used with me now, as if my age were a condition that needed managing. I made coffee and stood at the counter, staring at the wall, the mug warming my hands. The house was quiet in the way it only is early in the morning, before the world starts asking things of you. For a moment, I considered doing nothing, letting the process roll forward, letting someone else handle the thinking. It would have been easier. Instead, I picked up my phone and opened a blank note. I titled it, "What I Know," not what I feared, not what I suspected, just what I knew. I wrote down facts. I am 68 years old. I live alone. I pay my bills on time. I manage my medications. I drive myself. I have not been diagnosed with cognitive impairment. I have not agreed to give anyone authority over my decisions. Seeing it in writing steadied me more than I expected. It reminded me that reality still existed outside the documents being circulated about me. That morning, I canceled my cable service. Not because I needed to, not because anyone told me to. I did it because it required a phone call, a conversation, and a decision. The representative tried to talk me out of it. I listened. I declined. The call ended. I felt ridiculous for feeling proud of something so small. But small actions were all I trusted myself with right now. Later, I drove to the hardware store and bought a new lock for the back door. The old one worked fine. I just wanted to know I could replace it if I chose to. The young man at the counter asked if I needed help installing it. I said no. He smiled, unconvinced. I installed it myself that afternoon, hands shaking slightly as I tightened the screws. When it clicked into place, the sound was louder than I expected. That evening, I received an email from Andrew. It was longer than usual. He wrote about concern, about timelines, about how delaying decisions could limit options. He included Denise and someone else I didn't recognize on the thread, looping them in as if proximity would encourage compliance. I read the email once, then again. Then I replied, "Linda, I need clarity. Please send me a list of any decisions that have been made regarding my finances, healthcare, or living situation." I stared at the screen before hitting send. My heart was pounding. This was it. The moment where I might be labeled difficult. Or worse, incapable. The response didn't come right away. I spent the next day in a strange state of heightened awareness. Every sound felt sharper. Every interaction felt loaded. When the mail arrived, I watched from the window until the truck pulled away, then retrieved it slowly, half expecting another envelope to appear. Nothing did. By late afternoon, I was restless. I drove without a destination, letting the familiar roads calm me. I passed the school where I'd worked, the playground empty in the late fall light. I parked across the street and sat there for a while, remembering how it felt to be useful in a way no one questioned. Children had needed me, not to manage them, but to guide them, to show them where information lived and how to decide what to do with it. I wondered when adults had stopped offering me the same respect. When I got home, my phone buzzed. Andrew had replied. "Andrew, nothing has been finalized. We're in the information gathering phase." I read the message several times. "Linda, then please stop referring to plans as if they're already in motion." There was no immediate response. Instead, the next day, I received a call from someone new, a man named Paul. He introduced himself as a financial planner and spoke in a measured, professional tone. "I understand you have some questions," he said. "I have concerns," I replied. "Of course," he said smoothly. "That's completely natural." And natural, another word that smoothed over resistance. "Before we talk about anything else," I said, "I'd like to know who authorized you to contact me." There was a pause. "Well," he said carefully, "your stepson reached out on your behalf. Did he have my permission?" Another pause. Longer. "He expressed concern," Paul said. "We often work with family members in these situations." "I didn't authorize it," I said. "I see," he replied. "Perhaps we should clarify roles. To have a dine." "Yes," I said. "We should." When the call ended, I sat down at the kitchen table and felt something shift inside me. Not confidence, not relief, but a growing understanding of how fragile authority could be when it was built on assumption instead of consent. That night, I slept poorly. My mind replayed conversations, searching for moments I could have spoken sooner, clearer. I woke up before dawn and lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to my own breathing. I realized then that fear had been guiding me for weeks. Fear of being wrong, fear of being alone, fear of being seen as ungrateful or stubborn or, worst of all, confused. And beneath that fear was something else, a quiet anger at myself, not for trusting Andrew, but for disappearing so easily. In the morning, I called Karen again. "I think they're testing me," I said. "They are," she replied without hesitation. "They want to see how much pushback they'll get." I-4. "And if I don't push, then they'll keep going." I looked at the manila folder on my table. It no longer felt mysterious. It felt tactical. "I don't want to fight," I said. "You don't need one," Karen said. "You need boundaries." "How do I set them without proving their point?" I asked. She paused. "By staying calm, by documenting everything, and by making decisions that don't require their approval." That afternoon, I made an appointment with my primary care physician, not because anything was wrong, but because I wanted my medical record to reflect my reality, not someone else's narrative. During the visit, I spoke plainly about my independence, about my concerns. The doctor listened, typed notes, asked questions. When I left, I requested a copy of the visit summary. That piece of paper felt heavier than the others. I began keeping a file of my own, not defensive, factual, dates, names, words used, who contacted whom, who assumed what. It was exhausting, but it was grounding. The more I acted, the less helpless I felt. The more I spoke clearly, the harder it became for others to speak over me. Andrew noticed. His next call was shorter, more cautious. "I feel like you're pushing us away," he said. "I'm standing still," I replied. "You're the one who moved." Silence followed. "I just don't want you to end up alone in this," he said finally. I thought about the lock I'd installed, the list I'd written, the appointments I'd made. "I already am," I said. "I just didn't realize it before." When we hung up, my hands were shaking again. But this time, it wasn't fear. It was effort. Standing up after sitting too long always is. I didn't know what would come next. I only knew that whatever it was, it would have to meet me where I was, not where others had decided I belonged. And for the first time since this began, that felt like something I could handle. The first real proof didn't arrive with a bang. It slipped into my life disguised as courtesy. A large envelope appeared in my mailbox 3 days later, heavier than the others, addressed to me in a careful, professional hand. No return address, I recognized. I carried it inside, set it on the table, and left it there while I washed my hands, as if delaying the moment might soften whatever waited inside. When I finally opened it, the contents spread across the table like a story already told. Meeting notes. Not drafts, not questions. Notes. Typed, formatted, dated. There were headings, bullet points, even a summary section at the end. My name appeared throughout, always in the third person. Linda expressed openness to support. Linda acknowledged feeling overwhelmed by logistics. Linda appeared receptive to guided planning. I read those lines twice, then a third time, my mouth dry. None of them were lies. That was the most unsettling part. I had said I was tired. I had said paperwork overwhelmed me. I had said I appreciated help. Every sentence had been lifted from something real and rearranged into something else entirely. This wasn't forgery. It was curation. Tucked behind the notes was an email chain, printed out neatly. Names I recognized, names I didn't. The subject line read, "Client Overview, Initial Impressions." Client. I traced the word with my finger, feeling the paper resist slightly under my nail. The email wasn't malicious. It wasn't cruel. It was efficient. It described me as cooperative, agreeable, low resistance. It framed my questions as signs of anxiety, my hesitation as evidence of needing reassurance. There was even a line that made my stomach turn. Family involvement appears appropriate and stabilizing. I sat back in my chair and stared at the wall. This was the thing I hadn't been able to name before. Not manipulation, not control, interpretation. They weren't taking anything from me yet. They were deciding how everything I did would be understood. My phone rang. Andrew. I let it ring. I needed to finish reading. Further down the thread, someone asked whether it would be productive to include me more directly in early discussions. The response came quickly. Based on current interactions, indirect coordination seems more efficient. We can adjust if necessary. Efficient. I folded the paper carefully and set it aside. My hands were steady now. Too steady. When I finally answered Andrew's call, my voice surprised me. Calm. Even. "I received the notes," I said. A pause. "What notes?" "The ones describing me." Another pause. Longer. "Oh," he said. "Those are internal, just professionals talking things through." "Talking through my life," I said. "They're trying to help," he replied. "You're taking this personally." "I am a person," I said. Silence. "I never said you weren't," he said, defensive now. "Then why does it feel like I'm not in the room?" I asked. He sighed. "This is exactly why we wanted support. These conversations can be emotional." "They're not emotional," I said. "They're administrative." He didn't answer that. After we hung up, I gathered everything into a single pile. The folder, the packet, the notes. I didn't feel panicked. I felt focused, the way I used to feel when a student finally brought me a source list that didn't add up. I knew what to look for now. Patterns. Over the next few days, I reread every email, every summary, every message. I paid attention to what was emphasized and what was omitted. When I spoke clearly, it was reframed as reassurance needed. When I asked for time, it was logged as uncertainty. When I disagreed politely, it was described as stress. My voice wasn't erased. It was translated. I began writing my own summaries. Date, time, who contacted whom, exact words used, no interpretations, no conclusions. It felt tedious at first, then empowering. One afternoon, I received another call from Denise. Her tone was gentler now, cautious. "We just want to make sure you're comfortable moving forward," she said. "Forward to where?" I asked. "To a place where you're supported," she replied. "I am supported," I said. "I'm just not being heard." She hesitated. "Sometimes those two things overlap." "No," I said quietly. "Sometimes they replace each other." That night I lay awake thinking about something Mark had once said during a disagreement with his son. "Andrew doesn't lie," he'd told me. "He just decides what matters." At the time, I'd laughed it off. Now, it echoed. The next morning, I requested a copy of my own records from Denise's office. Not aggressively, not accusingly, just formally. I cited my right to access them. The response came within hours. Of course, happy to provide. What they sent confirmed everything I already suspected. There were narrative summaries, written in confident language, that presented a version of me that was plausible and incomplete. A Linda who needed guidance. A Linda who benefited from decisions being made smoothly, quietly, without too much friction. A Linda who existed primarily as a subject. I sat at my kitchen table with the documents spread out and realized something that shifted the ground beneath me. They didn't need me to agree. They only needed me not to object too loudly. The system wasn't designed to strip me of autonomy overnight. It was designed to make autonomy feel inconvenient, inefficient, optional. That afternoon, I drove to the park and sat on a bench overlooking the pond. Ducks drifted across the water, unbothered. A couple argued quietly on a nearby path. Life moved on, indifferent to my internal reckoning. I thought about how many people my age must slip into this process without ever noticing the shift. How many good sons and daughters told themselves they were helping. How many professionals convinced themselves they were protecting. And how few people ever asked the person at the center what it felt like. When I returned home, I made a decision. Not a big one, not a dramatic one. I emailed everyone on the chain. All of them. I thanked them for their concern and their time. Then, I attached my own document. It was short, clear, factual. It stated that no decisions regarding my finances, healthcare, or living arrangements were to be discussed or documented without my direct participation. That any summaries about me must be reviewed by me for accuracy. That any assumptions about my preferences were to be confirmed, not inferred. I didn't accuse. I didn't threaten, I asserted. My finger hovered over the send button for a long moment. Then I clicked. The replies didn't come right away. When they did, they were careful, polite, slightly rattled. Andrew called that evening. "I don't understand why you do this," he said. "It makes things awkward." "I understand exactly why," I replied. "It makes things accurate." "This isn't how these processes usually work," he said. "That's because most people don't see them happening," I said. He was quiet. "I thought you trusted me," he said finally. "I trusted you to treat me like an adult," I said. "That's not the same thing." When we hung up, my hands were shaking again. But beneath the fear was something steadier now. I had proof. Not of cruelty, not of malice, of a story being written about me without my consent. And once you see the story, you can refuse the ending. The fallout didn't come the way I expected. There was no angry phone call, no accusation, no dramatic confrontation where everything spilled into the open and someone admitted they'd gone too far. What followed was quieter than that, and far more revealing. The email slowed, not stopped, just slowed, as if someone had adjusted the flow to see how I would react. Messages that once arrived with urgency now came wrapped in courtesy. Phrases like "when convenient" and "at your discretion" began to appear. My name moved higher in the email threads. Sometimes it was even listed first. On the surface, it looked like progress. Underneath, something had shifted. I could feel it in the way Andrew spoke when he called. He was careful now, choosing words the way people do when they realize they're being listened to more closely than before. "I just don't want this to turn adversarial," he said one evening, his voice low, controlled. "I don't either," I replied. "That's why I'm being clear," he exhaled. "You know none of this was meant to hurt you." I believed him. That was the problem. The more I reviewed the notes, the emails, the summaries, the clearer something became. Andrew wasn't trying to take my life from me. He was trying to organize it, categorize it, make it manageable. And in his mind, that meant making it smaller. That realization hit harder than any accusation could have. I wasn't angry at him. I was grieving something else entirely the moment I realized I had already been downgraded in his imagination. That night, I sat in the living room with the lights off, staring at the reflection of the street lamp in the window. I thought about the way Andrew had started finishing my sentences in the last year, how he'd gently corrected me when I mixed up dates, even when I hadn't. How he'd begun explaining things I already understood, slowing his speech, simplifying his tone. None of it had seemed offensive at the time. It had felt like concern. Now I understood it as preparation. The point of no return wasn't a document or a meeting. It was the moment someone decided they knew better than you did what you needed and stopped checking whether they were right. That was the true break. Not betrayal. Replacement. The next morning, I woke with a strange sense of calm. Not relief, not confidence, just clarity. The kind that comes after a long internal argument finally ends. I wasn't fighting to prove I was capable. I was fighting to stop being defined. I made breakfast and ate it slowly, deliberately. Toast, eggs, black coffee. I cleaned the dishes immediately instead of letting them sit. I opened the curtains and let the light in. Small acts, ordinary acts, but each one felt like a declaration. I am here. I am present. I am participating in my own life. Later that day, I drove to the downtown office where the meeting had been scheduled weeks earlier, the one I'd declined. I hadn't told anyone I was coming. I parked, checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, and walked inside. The receptionist looked up, surprised. "Can I help you?" "Yes," I said. "I'm Linda Harris." Her eyes flicked to the screen. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said. "But there are notes about me here. I'd like to see who wrote them." She hesitated, clearly unsure how to proceed. "One moment." I waited, hands folded in front of me, heart steady. I wasn't angry. I wasn't demanding. I was simply refusing to be invisible. A woman emerged from the back office. I recognized her from the emails. "Linda," she said, smiling professionally. "This is unexpected." "So was the file," I replied. We sat in a small conference room. She spoke carefully, apologetically. She explained processes, misunderstandings, best practices. She acknowledged that things may have moved too quickly. What she didn't do was deny it. That told me everything. "I don't want to stop you from doing your job," I said when she finished. "I just want you to understand something." She nodded. "I am not confused," I said. "I am not overwhelmed. I am not a problem to be solved. I am a person who makes decisions more slowly than you're used to. That does not make me less capable." Her expression shifted. Not defensive, uncomfortable. "I hear you," she said. "I need you to listen," I replied. When I left the building, my legs felt weak, as if I'd just walked much farther than I had. I sat in my car for several minutes before turning the key, letting the adrenaline drain. This was the moment I understood something that changed everything. I didn't need to win. I needed to exit the story they were telling about me. That evening, I called Andrew. "I went to the office today," I said. There was a sharp intake of breath. "Why would you do that?" Because I needed to see where I was being discussed, I said. You're making this bigger than it needs to be, he snapped, the patience finally cracking. No, I said quietly. I'm seeing it for what it is. There was a long silence. I don't recognize you right now, he said. That makes two of us, I replied. When we hung up, my hands shook not with fear, but with release. The tension that had been coiled in my chest for weeks loosened slightly, not because things were resolved, but because I had stopped pretending they could be resolved by reassurance alone. The next few days were strange. Andrew didn't call. Denise didn't reach out. The emails became sparse, transactional. I wasn't being pushed anymore. I was being watched, and in that space, I made a choice that surprised even me. I stopped responding, not out of spite, not to provoke a reaction. I simply stepped back. I lived my days without updating anyone, without checking whether my silence would be interpreted correctly. I went to the grocery store. I met Karen for lunch. I walked the park path in the afternoons and fed the ducks stale bread I shouldn't have been feeding them. I let the narrative starve. That was the true shift. When Andrew finally called again, his voice sounded different. Not angry, not confident. I don't know where we stand, he said. We stand where we always have, I replied. You just didn't notice until I stopped moving in the direction you expected. He sighed. I was just trying to do the right thing. I know, I said. But you decided what the right thing was without me. There was nothing else to say after that. I hung up and sat there, the phone still in my hand, realizing that this was the real loss. Not trust, not safety, authority, not taken from me, handed away by someone who thought I no longer needed it. And now that I had taken it back, quietly and without permission, there was no way to return to the version of our relationship that existed before. The ground had shifted, not because I had fought, but because I had stepped out of the role they'd written for me. And once you do that, there is no unlearning what you've seen. Once I stopped responding, time began to behave differently. Days passed without interruption, and instead of feeling anxious, I felt oddly light, as if I'd been carrying a weight so long I'd forgotten it was there. I woke up without checking my phone. I made decisions without rehearsing how I would justify them to someone else later. I moved through my house as if it belonged to me again, not as a temporary holding place awaiting review. The silence wasn't peaceful at first. It was unfamiliar. Every few hours, I caught myself wondering whether I should send an update, clarify my position, soften the edges of what I'd said. Old habits don't disappear just because you name them. They linger, waiting for stress to invite them back. But nothing happened. No urgent calls. No warnings. No consequences. That, too, told me something. One afternoon, I drove out to a small independent bookstore 30 minutes away, the kind tucked between a nail salon and a dry cleaner. I'd been meaning to go for years and never had. Inside, the shelves were uneven, the lighting warm and slightly dim. I wandered without a purpose, letting my hands pull books from spines at random. I bought 3 I didn't need, and sat in the car afterward, flipping through one of them, just because I could. That evening, I cooked dinner for myself and ate it at the table instead of on the couch. I noticed how quiet the house had become since Mark died, how I'd filled that quiet with other people's voices, calls, emails, instructions without realizing it. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night. The next morning, a letter arrived. Not an email, an actual letter, folded neatly, addressed in careful handwriting. It was from Denise. She wrote about misunderstanding, about intentions, about wanting to reset the conversation. She suggested a meeting, just the two of us, to clear the air. I read it once, then placed it back in the envelope. I didn't respond. This wasn't avoidance. It was alignment. I was no longer interested in clarifying my position to people who only heard me when I disrupted their process. I wasn't trying to be understood anymore. I was trying to live accurately. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't planned. I drove to a small community center on the edge of town, the one with the bulletin board always cluttered with flyers. I walked in and asked about volunteer opportunities, not out of obligation, out of curiosity. They needed help cataloging donations for a weekly book exchange program. The woman at the desk asked about my experience. I smiled. I was a librarian, I said. She brightened immediately. Perfect. I started the following Tuesday. The work was simple. Sorting, labeling, recommending books to people who wandered in without knowing what they wanted. It felt familiar in a way that settled my nerves. No one questioned my capacity. No one spoke over me. They listened. When Andrew called that weekend, I almost didn't answer. Almost. "Where have you been?" he asked, not angrily, but with something like unease. "I've been busy," I said. "With what?" "With my life." He paused. "We need to talk." "We've been talking for weeks," I replied. "You just didn't like what I was saying." "That's not fair," he said. "I'm not trying to be fair," I said. "I'm trying to be clear," he sighed. "You're shutting us out." "I'm stepping back," I corrected. "There's a difference." There it was. The moment he realized he could no longer reach into my days without invitation. "I don't know how to help you if you won't engage," he said. "I don't need help," I said gently. "I need space." When we hung up, my hands didn't shake this time. My heart didn't race. I felt tired, but it was the kind of tired that comes after finishing something, not avoiding it. Over the next few weeks, the pattern held. Fewer calls, fewer emails, fewer attempts to check in. Andrew's messages, when they came, were cautious, neutral. Updates about his life, not my plans. He was recalibrating, trying to find the edges of this new distance without saying it out loud. I let him. One afternoon, I took the manila folder out of the drawer where I'd put it and laid it on the table. I flipped through the pages one last time. The language that had once unsettled me now felt oddly flat, like reading a biography of someone I no longer recognized. This was the life I hadn't agreed to. I placed the folder in a box with other papers I no longer needed and taped it shut. Not destroyed, not hidden, just stored away, stripped of its power. That night, I stood in my backyard under the maple tree Mark had planted. The leaves had turned fully now, red and gold scattered across the grass. I didn't rake them. I let them sit, a quiet mess no one needed to fix. I realized then that my response hadn't been a confrontation or a refusal. It had been a withdrawal of participation. I hadn't argued my way out. I had walked. The difference mattered. People who rely on momentum lose their footing when you stop moving. People who assume consent panic when silence replaces compliance. Andrew didn't become my enemy. Denise didn't reveal herself as a villain. No one's mask slipped dramatically. Instead, something subtler happened. They lost access, and without access, their concern had nowhere to land. One evening, Karen and I sat on my porch with glasses of iced tea, watching the sun dip behind the trees. "You look different," she said. "Do I?" "You look settled," she replied. "That's not the same thing as happy." "I know," I said, "but it's closer to honest." She nodded. "Most people never get there." I thought about that later, alone in the quiet house, about how easily I might have drifted into the role they'd prepared for me if I hadn't felt that first moment of wrongness, if I'd trusted the language instead of my body. I wasn't triumphant. I wasn't proud. I was awake. And somewhere, I knew this wasn't over. You don't step out of someone else's story without consequences. They don't always arrive loudly, but they do arrive. Still, I didn't regret it. For the first time since Mark died, the future didn't feel like something being arranged on my behalf. It felt like a wide, uncertain space, and it was mine. The first sign that something had shifted came quietly, wrapped in politeness. Andrew didn't call for nearly 2 weeks. When he finally did, it wasn't with urgency or frustration. It was with uncertainty. "I just wanted to check in," he said, his voice careful, as if he were stepping onto unfamiliar ground. "Make sure everything's okay." Everything was fine. That was the strange part. Nothing was wrong. I wasn't sick. I wasn't behind on anything. I hadn't fallen or forgotten or missed a payment. And yet, his question carried weight, as if something must be wrong if I wasn't reporting in. "I'm doing well," I said. There was a pause. "That's good," he replied, but he sounded unconvinced. After we hung up, I sat with that moment longer than I expected. It wasn't anger I felt, it was recognition. He didn't know what to do without updates, without data, without confirmation that his involvement still mattered. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated. A text asking how I was feeling, an email forwarding an article about healthy aging with no commentary attached, a voicemail reminding me that help was available whenever I wanted to talk. None of it crossed a line. All of it hovered near one. I didn't respond, not because I was trying to punish him, but because I was paying attention to what happened when I didn't fill the space. I wanted to see whether concern would turn into pressure, or whether it would simply dissolve when it had nowhere to land. It dissolved. At the volunteer center, no one asked how I was managing. They assumed I was. That assumption felt like a gift. I cataloged books, recommended novels to strangers, laughed with a retired teacher who argued passionately about mystery authors. When I left each afternoon, I felt anchored, as if I had returned to a version of myself that had been waiting patiently. Then, one evening, Andrew showed up. No call, no warning, just his car pulling into the driveway as I was finishing dinner. I watched from the window as he sat there for a moment before getting out, adjusting his jacket, rehearsing something in his head. I opened the door before he knocked. He looked startled. "I didn't want to intrude," he said. "You already did," I replied calmly, stepping aside. "You might as well come in." He sat at the kitchen table, glancing around as if looking for signs of change. The house hadn't transformed. There were no pill organizers lining the counter, no stacks of unopened mail, just a clean table, a plate drying by the sink, the faint smell of garlic still in the air. "I feel like you've shut me out," he said after a moment. "I feel like you're not used to not being central," I replied. He frowned. "That's not fair." "Neither is being discussed without being included," I said. He rubbed his hands together, a nervous habit I'd noticed before. "We're just worried. When someone pulls away like this, it usually means something's wrong." I studied him, the tight jaw, the careful posture. He wasn't worried about my well-being. He was worried about losing visibility. "There's nothing wrong," I said. "I'm just not reporting my life anymore." "That's not how families work," he said. "That's exactly how families work," I replied. "We live our lives. We share when we choose." He opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, he looked genuinely unsettled. "Do you have any idea how this looks?" he asked. "To whom?" I said. He hesitated. "To everyone." "There is no everyone," I said. "There's just you, trying to manage something you no longer control." The words hung between us, heavy but accurate. He stood abruptly. "I don't know how to do this with you anymore," he said. "You don't have to," I replied. "That's the point." When he left, he didn't hug me. The next development came from Denise. She emailed, proposing a wrap-up conversation. Her tone was conciliatory, almost apologetic. She acknowledged that things may have moved faster than they should have. She suggested revisiting goals, resetting expectations. I read it once and closed the laptop. There was nothing left to revisit. What surprised me was how quickly the system recalibrated once I stopped participating. Without my engagement, there was nothing to organize. Without my compliance, there was no justification for oversight. The machine didn't fight back. It simply disengaged. That was the most revealing part of all. Control, I realized, often depends on cooperation more than force. The following week, I received a short email from Andrew. "Andrew, I think it's best if we take a step back for a while." I stared at the screen, waiting for the familiar ache to surface. It didn't. "Linda, I agree." That was it. No argument, no plea, no attempt to reframe the situation, just a mutual recognition that the dynamic we'd been operating under no longer functioned. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was recalibrated. I noticed it in small ways, in the way I planned my days without anticipating interruption, in the way I made decisions without rehearsing explanations, in the way my shoulders sat lower, my breath deeper. One afternoon, I ran into a neighbor I hadn't spoken to in years. She asked how I was doing, genuinely curious. I told her I'd started volunteering. She smiled, impressed, and asked for details, not because she needed to assess me, but because she wanted to know. That difference mattered. At home, I sorted through old photographs, something I'd avoided since Mark died. I lingered on images of our early years, the way his hand always rested at the small of my back, the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. I realized that part of my grief hadn't just been losing him. It had been losing the person who saw me as a full adult, not a problem to be solved. Andrew had loved his father. I didn't doubt that. But love didn't automatically grant insight or authority. Weeks passed. Autumn deepened. The maple tree shed its leaves, leaving the yard bare and honest. I raked them this time, piling them neatly by the curb, not because someone told me to, but because I wanted the yard to look the way I felt: clear, intentional. One evening, Karen asked if I regretted anything. I regret not noticing sooner, I said. Not because it would have changed them, but because it would have spared me the confusion. Most people don't notice until it's too late, she said. I thought about that long after she left, about how easily concern slips into control, how quickly help becomes management, how often women my age are praised for being agreeable, then quietly punished for it. I wasn't angry at Andrew anymore. I wasn't even disappointed. I was aware. And awareness, once it arrives, doesn't leave. The final confirmation came months later, in the form of an offhand comment from Andrew during a brief phone call about holiday plans. "You seem different," he said. "I am," I replied. He hesitated. "You don't need us the way you used to." "I never did," I said. "You just thought I did." There was no response to that. When the call ended, I sat alone in my living room, the light fading outside, the house quiet but no longer heavy. I thought about all the versions of myself that had existed in other people's plans: the manageable one, the cooperative one, the one who would eventually step aside. Those versions no longer applied. Not because I'd fought them off, but because I'd stopped feeding them, and in that absence, something else had taken root. Not victory, not justice, autonomy, quiet, unremarkable, uncontested, and once reclaimed, impossible to misunderstand again. The decision didn't arrive as a declaration. There was no moment where I sat at the table, hands folded, and announced to myself that I was about to change everything. It came the way most honest decisions do, quietly, while I was doing something else. I was standing in line at the pharmacy, waiting to pick up a refill, when the woman in front of me started arguing with the clerk about insurance coverage. Her voice rose, sharp with panic. She kept saying the same thing over and over, but I was told this would be taken care of. When it was my turn, the clerk smiled apologetically, bracing herself. "Your total is $12, she said. I paid, thanked her, and stepped aside. Nothing remarkable, no conflict, no confusion. Just a transaction I understood. As I walked back to my car, something clicked. I wasn't afraid of losing control anymore. I was afraid of being positioned again, of having a role waiting for me that I hadn't chosen. A role that could be reactivated, the moment I hesitated, the moment I asked for help, the moment I needed something. As long as that role existed, it could be filled. That afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table and opened my planner. Not the calendar with appointments others had tried to schedule for me, but the small one I kept for myself. I flipped ahead, scanning empty weeks. What I saw wasn't loneliness. It was availability. I made a list, not of grievances or defenses, of options. Sell the house, rent it out, downsize, move closer to town, move farther away, stay. For the first time, none of the options felt loaded. They were just possibilities. No one was pushing me toward any of them. No one was warning me about what would happen if I chose wrong. I didn't choose that day. Instead, I called a realtor. Her name was Megan. She came recommended by Karen, and when she arrived a few days later, she didn't comment on my age or ask whether my family was involved. She asked what I wanted. "I don't know yet," I said. "That's fine," she replied. "We can still talk." We walked through the house together. She noted the creaky stair, the aging roof, the garden that needed attention. She spoke in terms of facts, not urgency. When she finished, she sat at the table and waited. "Are you thinking of selling?" she asked. "I'm thinking of removing the house from other people's plans," I said. She smiled, not unkindly. "That's a good reason." That night, I slept with the windows open, listening to the wind move through the trees. The house felt different, not like an anchor, but like a chapter that had been read enough times to be set down. Over the next few weeks, I didn't announce anything to Andrew. I didn't explain. I didn't ask permission. I simply moved forward, one step at a time, documenting decisions the way I always had when something mattered. I met with a financial advisor of my own choosing, a woman close to my age, sharp and direct, who asked me what I wanted my money to do, not how it could be managed most efficiently. "I don't want it to manage me," I said. "Good," she replied. "Then we're aligned." We talked about longevity, about independence, about flexibility. Not once did she suggest I simplify my life for someone else's comfort. I also met with an attorney, not because I planned to contest anything or accuse anyone. I wanted to understand my options in language that belonged to me, not to a process designed to move me along. When I left that office, I felt a strange relief, not because I'd secured protection, but because I'd removed ambiguity. There would be no gray area left for interpretation. The twist, when it came, wasn't dramatic. There was no confrontation where I revealed my plan and watched faces fall. That would have kept me in the story they were telling. Instead, I did something quieter. I dismantled the role entirely. I listed the house, not immediately, not impulsively, with care, with intention, with a timeline that suited me. I didn't rush. I didn't delay. I chose. When Andrew found out, it was through someone else, a mutual acquaintance who mentioned it casually, assuming he already knew. He called that evening, his voice tight with surprise. "You're selling the house?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Why wouldn't you tell me?" "Because it isn't an announcement," I replied. "It's a decision." "But what about?" He stopped himself. "What are you planning to do?" "I'm planning to live," I said. "That's vague," he said, frustrated. "It's accurate," I replied. He went quiet, then tried again. "This feels drastic." "It's proportional," I said. "To what?" he asked. "To the amount of my life that was being discussed without me," I replied. He didn't argue after that. There was nothing to argue with. Over the next month, the house filled with strangers again, buyers this time, not planners. They commented on the light, the layout, the potential. I watched from a distance, unattached. The house no longer felt like something that defined me. It felt like an asset I had enjoyed and was ready to release. Andrew came by once during that period, walking through rooms with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not anger, not grief, something closer to displacement. "I didn't think you'd actually do it," he said. "I didn't think I'd need to," I replied. We stood in the living room, the walls bare where photos had already been taken down. "Where will you go?" he asked. "Somewhere that doesn't already know who I'm supposed to be," I said. That was the moment he understood. Not that he'd lost control, that there was nothing left to control. I didn't move into a smaller version of my old life. I didn't trade one monitored environment for another. I rented an apartment in a neighborhood closer to the city, near the bookstore and the volunteer center, a place with noise, with choices, with people who didn't know my history. The day I handed over the keys, I felt sadness, but it was clean, uncomplicated. I wasn't being pushed out. I was stepping forward. Andrew helped me move a few boxes. He was polite, careful. as if unsure where he fit now. "Call if you need anything," he said, standing awkwardly in the doorway of my new place. "I will," I said, and I meant it, but not in the way he expected. That night, I sat on the floor of my new living room, surrounded by boxes, eating takeout from a place down the street. The city hummed outside the window. I felt tired in a good way. The story that had been forming around me of decline, of oversight, of necessary intervention had nowhere to land anymore. Not because I'd fought it, but because I'd removed the stage, and in that absence, something unexpected happened. No one rushed to fill it. No one chased me down with new plans or revised narratives. The machine didn't reconfigure itself around me. It simply moved on, and so did I. That was the twist no one anticipated. I didn't reclaim what was mine. I stepped out of the framework that made it claimable in the first place. And in doing so, I didn't win. I disappeared from a story that no longer deserved me. The aftermath wasn't loud. It didn't come with raised voices or dramatic reckonings. It arrived the way most lasting changes do, through small adjustments that added up to something irreversible. The first week in the apartment felt temporary, like I was staying somewhere between decisions. I left boxes unopened. I slept on the mattress without a frame. I drank coffee out of a mug I hadn't bothered to unpack properly. Outside, buses hissed at the corner. People talked on sidewalks. A siren passed once an hour like punctuation. No one checked on me. That was the part I noticed most. Not in a hurt way, in a clarifying way. Back in the house, even silence had felt supervised. Someone always seemed to be waiting for a sign of confusion, of struggle, of need. Here, the absence of attention wasn't neglect, it was neutrality. I existed without explanation. Andrew texted once, a few days after the move. "Andrew, hope you're settling in okay." I stared at the message longer than I needed to. "Linda, I am. Thank you." That was the entire exchange. Weeks earlier, that brevity would have felt cold. Now, it felt correct. We were speaking as two adults whose lives overlapped, not as a caretaker and a subject negotiating boundaries. At the volunteer center, no one asked why I'd moved. They only asked whether I could come in an extra day to help with sorting donations. I said yes. The work filled hours that had once been consumed by worry about how I was being perceived, how my choices might be interpreted. Here, no one interpreted them. I walked more. I learned which streets were noisy and which stayed quiet. I found a cafe that didn't rush you out if you sat with a book too long. I memorized the bus schedule even though I still drove, just to know my options. Choice began to feel normal again. One afternoon, Karen visited. She sat on the floor with me because the couch hadn't arrived yet, both of us leaning against unpacked boxes. "You did it," she said, not celebratory, just observant. "I moved," I replied. She smiled. "You changed the terms." That was closer to the truth. Andrew came by once more, a month later. He stood in the doorway, looking around, trying to orient himself. "It's smaller," he said. "Yes," I replied. He nodded, as if filing that away. "You seem fine." "I am," I said. He hesitated. "You know, if you ever need help—" "I know," I interrupted gently. "And if I do, I'll ask." That sentence landed between us like a line drawn without chalk. Clear, undeniable. He nodded again, this time slower. When he left, there was no tension trailing behind him, just space. I noticed changes in myself, too. Subtle ones. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. I stopped anticipating objections before making plans. I began answering questions honestly instead of strategically. When someone asked how I was doing, I said good if I meant it, and tired if I didn't. I no longer softened truths to make them easier to accept. That shift rippled outward. Andrew called less. When he did, he listened more. Not because I demanded it, but because I was no longer negotiating my own credibility. Denise never reached out again. The system had adjusted. Without my participation, there was nothing left to manage, no file to update, no narrative to refine. That, more than anything, confirmed what I'd already suspected. Concern that requires compliance isn't concern. It's leverage. I didn't feel triumphant about any of this. There was no satisfaction in having disrupted a process. What I felt was steadiness, the kind that comes when you stop bracing for impact. One evening, as I unpacked the last box, I found the manila folder at the bottom, the one that had started everything. I opened it, leafed through the pages, then closed it again. It felt smaller now. I considered throwing it away. Instead, I slid it into a drawer, not as a warning or a trophy, as a reminder of how quietly things can shift when you stop paying attention. Life settled into a rhythm, not a perfect one, not an easy one, just one that belonged to me. I made mistakes. I forgot appointments. I misjudged how long errands would take. None of it was catastrophic. None of it required intervention, and no one rushed in to document it. Sometimes, late at night, I thought about how close I'd come to accepting a version of myself that wasn't mine, how easily I could have mistaken accommodation for safety, efficiency for care. I didn't blame Andrew anymore, or the professionals, or even myself. I blamed the story we're all taught that aging means disappearing slowly, that being agreeable is the same as being protected. I'd learned otherwise. The cost of stepping away had been real: distance, awkwardness, a quiet grief for a relationship that would never quite return to what it was. But the cost of staying would have been greater. It would have required me to keep shrinking. One night, I sat by the window and watched the city move cars, lights, strangers heading somewhere I didn't need to know. I felt something close to gratitude, not for the struggle, but for the clarity it forced on me. No one had punished me for choosing myself. They'd simply adjusted. And that, I realized, was the truth no one ever says out loud. Most systems don't fight you when you step out. They just move on to someone easier. And if you're paying attention, that can be the greatest freedom of all. By the time winter arrived, the story had stopped following me. That was the clearest sign it was over. Snow came early that year, soft at first, then heavy enough to change how the city moved. I learned which sidewalks the sun reached in the morning and which ones stayed icy all day. I learned which bus drivers waited an extra second if they saw you running and which ones didn't. I learned the sound my apartment made when the heat kicked on in the middle of the night, a low click followed by a slow exhale. These were not things anyone else tracked for me. They were mine. Andrew called on Christmas Eve, not to check on me, not to ask what I'd decided about anything, just to say hello. "Do you want to come by tomorrow?" he asked. His voice carried no expectation, no plan underneath the invitation. "I'll stay here," I said, "but thank you for asking." "Also, okay," he replied, and meant it. When we hung up, I felt a brief pang, not regret, exactly, more like the recognition of a door that would never open the same way again. I let the feeling pass without naming it. That, too, was new. I spent Christmas Day alone and not lonely. I made soup, I read, I walked in the snow until my toes went numb and my cheeks burned. I watched lights flicker on in other people's windows and felt no urge to explain myself to anyone behind them. In January, I stopped volunteering at the book exchange one afternoon a week and started attending a writing group at the community center instead. No one asked for my credentials. No one cared what I'd done before. They only cared whether I showed up and read aloud when it was my turn. I did. My voice sounded steadier than I expected. In February, I forgot an appointment. I realized it halfway through the day and laughed out loud in my kitchen, alone. Nothing happened. No cascade of consequences. No one used it as evidence of anything. I rescheduled and moved on. That moment stayed with me longer than it should have. It was proof of something I hadn't fully trusted yet. Mistakes don't always lead somewhere worse. Sometimes they just end. Andrew and I found a rhythm that wasn't close but wasn't brittle either. We spoke occasionally. We talked about ordinary things. He no longer tried to solve me. I no longer tried to reassure him. We were two adults, related by history, not obligation. That was enough. One afternoon in early spring, I took the manila folder out of the drawer for the last time. I spread its contents across the table, not with tension, but with curiosity. I read the language that had once felt so heavy, so definitive. It read differently now, not threatening, just small. I gathered the pages, folded them neatly, and placed them in the recycling bin. The sound they made as they dropped in was unremarkable. Paper on paper. That felt right. I didn't need to keep proof of what I'd escaped. I didn't need to remember every step that had brought me here. The lesson had already moved somewhere deeper, into how I noticed things, how I responded or didn't. The truth was, nothing dramatic had happened in the end. No apology, no reckoning, no justice delivered by anyone else's hand. The world hadn't corrected itself. I had. What I'd learned was simple, and it took me nearly 70 years to understand it. You don't lose your life all at once. You lose it in small accommodations, in reasonable compromises, in moments where staying agreeable feels safer than staying present. And you don't reclaim it by fighting. You reclaim it by choosing where to stand and refusing to be moved. There are still days when I feel my age, when my knees ache, when my energy dips, when I think about the future and feel its weight press down a little heavier than it used to. None of that scares me anymore, because none of it requires someone else to decide who I am. I am older, I am slower, I am careful, and I am still the one living this life. That's the ending no one plans for. Not triumph, not revenge, not even reconciliation, just a quiet alignment between who you are and how you move through the world. Nothing was taken back. Nothing was given. I simply stopped handing myself over. And in that silence, without witnesses, without approval, I found something that felt a lot like peace.